Lewis Hamilton didn't join Ferrari simply to wear red. He joined because he believed Ferrari could give him one final chance to fight for a record-breaking 8th World Championship. But 6 months into the season, that dream has looked far more complicated than anyone expected. There have been flashes of brilliance, strong qualifying laps, moments where Hamilton looked capable of matching the front runners, even races where Ferrari appeared to have genuine podium pace. Yet something has always been missing. Not speed, not experience, not motivation. Consistency. Every weekend seemed to follow the same pattern. The Ferrari would look competitive during one session, then suddenly lose its balance in the next. Hamilton would feel confident attacking one corner, only to find the rear becoming unpredictable a few laps later. The raw pace was always there. Unlocking it consistently wasn't. That has become Ferrari's biggest challenge. And according to growing reports inside the Formula One paddock, engineers in Maranello may have finally discovered exactly why. If they're right, this isn't just another setup adjustment. It could be the breakthrough that finally allows Hamilton to drive the Ferrari the way he's been trying to since the very first day he climbed into the car. Because what Ferrari has discovered isn't hidden inside the engine or the aerodynamics. It's hidden much deeper than that. To understand why this matters, you first have to understand something about Lewis Hamilton's driving style. Throughout his entire Formula One career, Hamilton has always preferred a car that behaves in an incredibly predictable way. He likes attacking corners under heavy braking, rotating the car early, getting back onto the throttle before most drivers would even consider it. It's a driving style built entirely around confidence. When Hamilton trusts the rear of the car, he becomes almost impossible to stop. We've seen it throughout his championship-winning years at Mercedes. He could brake impossibly late, carry incredible speed through medium-speed corners, and somehow still preserve his tires better than almost everyone around him. That combination made him one of Formula One's greatest drivers, but Ferrari hasn't always allowed him to drive that way. Since arriving in Maranello, Hamilton has repeatedly spoken about adapting, learning, changing his approach. Instead of attacking corners naturally, he often found himself managing the Ferrari's balance, waiting longer before committing to the throttle, making small steering corrections that never appeared during his Mercedes years. To most fans, those differences looked insignificant. To Formula One engineers, they revealed everything, because when a driver starts compensating for the car instead of simply driving it, lap time disappears almost immediately. Not because the driver becomes slower, because confidence disappears, and confidence is worth far more than most people realize. In Formula One, confidence can mean braking 2 meters later, opening the steering fractionally earlier, applying full throttle a tenth of a second sooner. Those tiny differences happen dozens of times every lap. By the end of a Grand Prix, they become several seconds. Ferrari knew Hamilton wasn't driving below his ability. The data proved otherwise. His inputs remained remarkably precise. His racecraft was as sharp as ever. The problem wasn't the driver. It was giving that driver a platform he could trust. That's why Ferrari spent the opening part of the season asking a completely different question from most rival teams. Instead of searching for more downforce, or more horsepower, engineers focused on understanding why Hamilton never seemed completely comfortable over an entire race distance. The answer wasn't obvious. Every simulator session produced new clues. Telemetry showed that Hamilton and Charles Leclerc were extracting performance in very different ways. Leclerc naturally adapted to small balance changes. Hamilton preferred stability. Neither approach was wrong, but it presented Ferrari with a difficult engineering challenge. How do you build one Formula One car capable of satisfying two completely different driving styles? For months, that question remained unanswered. Then something started changing. Not dramatically, almost quietly. Hamilton's radio messages became calmer. The complaints about rear instability became less frequent. Long-run pace improved. Engineers noticed his steering inputs becoming smoother during race simulations. Most importantly, Hamilton himself stopped talking about adapting to Ferrari. Instead, he began talking about understanding it. That subtle change may reveal far more than most people realized, because understanding a Formula One car is often the final step before unlocking its true performance. Several experienced paddock observers have since suggested Ferrari's biggest recent breakthrough hasn't been a visible upgrade at all. Instead, it may have come from identifying an operating window where the SF26 behaves far more predictably. That phrase, operating window sounds highly technical. In reality, it affects everything: ride height, suspension movement, brake temperatures, tire pressures, aerodynamic balance. When every one of those elements works together, the car suddenly becomes much easier to drive. Drivers stop chasing balance, they start chasing lap time. Ferrari believes it's getting closer to exactly that point, and the evidence has slowly begun appearing on track. Hamilton has looked increasingly comfortable carrying speed into braking zones. His corner exits have become cleaner. His tire management has improved. These aren't dramatic changes. They're the kind of improvements only engineers usually notice, but they're often the first signs that something much bigger is happening underneath. If Ferrari has genuinely found a setup philosophy that suits Hamilton's natural instincts, the implications extend far beyond one strong race weekend. Because for the first time since joining Ferrari, Hamilton may finally be getting a car that allows him to stop adapting and simply start driving. And once Lewis Hamilton reaches that point, Formula One history suggests something remarkable often follows. But the most fascinating part of Ferrari's discovery wasn't what they changed. It was how they discovered it and why that process could reshape the rest of Hamilton's season. The breakthrough didn't begin on a race weekend. It began long before the lights ever went out. Behind closed doors in Maranello, Ferrari's engineers had started noticing something unusual in Hamilton's telemetry. The numbers weren't pointing to a lack of speed. In fact, over a single lap, Hamilton was often matching or occasionally exceeding the pace the team expected. The problem appeared after that, as fuel loads changed, as tire temperatures increased, and as the balance of the car evolved throughout a stint. Hamilton's confidence slowly disappeared. The lap times didn't suddenly collapse. They simply stopped improving. Meanwhile, Charles Leclerc continued extracting performance in a slightly different way. At first, engineers assumed it was simply the difference between two driving styles. After all, Leclerc had spent years developing Ferrari machinery. He instinctively knew where the car would become nervous. He expected the rear to move. He adjusted almost without thinking. Hamilton approached the corners differently. He preferred planting the car under braking before rotating it aggressively toward the apex. It was the same style that had delivered 7 world championships. The Ferrari, however, wasn't rewarding that approach. Instead of remaining planted under heavy braking, the rear axle occasionally became unpredictable, not enough to create dramatic mistakes, just enough to force Hamilton into hesitation. And in Formula One, hesitation is incredibly expensive. Losing 0.02 of a second in one corner sounds insignificant. Lose the same amount in 10 corners across 70 laps, and suddenly you've given away several seconds. That's exactly what Ferrari's engineers started seeing. The issue wasn't Hamilton's outright pace, it was repeatability. The car behaved brilliantly for a few laps, then slightly differently for the next 5. Those tiny changes forced Hamilton to constantly recalculate where the limit was. Instead of attacking instinctively, he was driving cautiously. For a driver whose greatest weapon has always been confidence, that was a major problem. So Ferrari changed its approach. Rather than chasing maximum downforce, engineers began asking a different question. What makes Hamilton trust the car? That completely changed the direction of development. Instead of focusing purely on aerodynamic performance, attention shifted toward mechanical consistency. Suspension settings were revised. Brake migration maps were adjusted. Engine braking characteristics were refined. Even the smallest setup details received fresh attention. None of these changes promised dramatic gains on paper. Individually, they barely moved the stopwatch. Together, however, they transformed how the SF-26 behaved over an entire race distance. The first signs appeared during simulator work. Hamilton immediately reported that the car felt calmer entering corners. The rear remained more predictable while trail braking. He no longer needed constant steering corrections during corner entry. Engineers compared the telemetry against previous simulations. The difference wasn't enormous, but it was remarkably consistent. That consistency encouraged Ferrari to test the same philosophy during race weekends. The early results were encouraging. Hamilton's long-run pace became more stable. His tire degradation improved. Most importantly, his confidence returned. You could actually hear it in the radio messages. Earlier in the season, Hamilton frequently asked questions: the balance, the rear grip, the braking behavior. Recently, those conversations have become far more focused on strategy and race management. That shift tells engineers something important. Drivers only stop discussing the car when the car stops surprising them. Perhaps that's Ferrari's biggest discovery. Not extra horsepower, not a revolutionary aerodynamic package. Predictability. That may sound almost boring compared to headlines about upgrades. Inside Formula One, it's priceless. Predictability allows drivers to commit. Commitment creates speed. Speed creates opportunities. And opportunities win championships. Austria provided the perfect environment to test exactly that. The Red Bull Ring is one of the most demanding circuits under braking. 3 major braking zones, repeated uphill acceleration, constant transitions between slow and medium-speed corners. Any instability becomes obvious almost immediately. Instead of struggling through those sections, Hamilton looked increasingly comfortable. He attacked corner entry, applied throttle earlier, managed the rear tires more effectively over long runs. These weren't isolated improvements. They followed the same pattern Ferrari had already seen inside the simulator. For engineers, that confirmation was incredibly valuable. Simulation matched reality. Reality matched the data. The development direction was finally making sense. Perhaps even more importantly, Ferrari began discovering something about the SF26 that had remained hidden for months. The car wasn't fundamentally difficult to drive. It simply demanded an operating window so narrow that maintaining it across an entire race became almost impossible. Now that window appears significantly wider. Track temperatures can change without destroying balance. Fuel loads no longer transform the handling characteristics. Drivers spend less time searching for grip and more time maximizing performance. That single discovery could influence every future upgrade Ferrari introduces. Instead of constantly correcting weaknesses, engineers can finally begin building on strengths, and that may be exactly why rival teams have started paying much closer attention, because once a Formula One team truly understands its own car, become. Every update has a clearer purpose. Every setup adjustment produces more reliable results. Momentum begins building naturally. Ferrari believes it's entering that phase now. But there is another consequence that could prove even more important. If Hamilton has finally found a Ferrari that complements his natural driving style rather than forcing him to adapt, then the second half of the season may feature a completely different version of the 7-time world champion. And if history has taught Formula One fans anything, it's that Lewis Hamilton is at his most dangerous when confidence and consistency finally come together. If Ferrari's latest discovery is as significant as it appears, then the biggest change won't be measured by lap times alone. It will be measured by confidence, because confidence has always been Lewis Hamilton's greatest weapon. Throughout his career, Hamilton has rarely needed the fastest car to win races. What he needed was a car he could trust, one that reacted the same way on lap 1 as it did on lap 50, one that allowed him to brake on instinct instead of calculation, one that gave him the freedom to attack rather than constantly manage its weaknesses. That was the foundation of Mercedes' dominance during Hamilton's championship years. The engineers built cars that behaved predictably in almost every condition, whether the race was hot or cold, whether tire degradation was high or low. Hamilton always knew where the limit was. That certainty allowed him to extract performances that often looked impossible. Ferrari has been trying to recreate that feeling ever since he arrived, not by copying Mercedes, but by understanding what their own car needed to become. For much of the season, that goal seemed frustratingly out of reach. Every improvement solved one problem while exposing another. A stronger front end sometimes made the rear unstable. Additional downforce occasionally increased tire degradation. One solution created 2 new questions. That cycle made consistent progress incredibly difficult. Now, however, Ferrari appears to have broken that pattern. Instead of chasing maximum performance every weekend, the team has shifted its focus toward building a more predictable platform. That decision could change the remainder of Hamilton's season, because Formula One development becomes much more effective once engineers stop fighting the car's basic characteristics. Every future upgrade can now build on a stable foundation. Instead of asking, will this create another problem? Engineers can finally ask, how much faster can we make it? That is a completely different position to be in, and history suggests it often marks the beginning of a team's biggest leap forward. Perhaps the clearest evidence is Hamilton himself. Compare his body language from the opening races to more recent weekends. Earlier in the year, he often climbed out of the cockpit looking puzzled. Interviews were filled with uncertainty. He spoke about learning, adapting, searching for answers. Recently, the conversation has changed. Hamilton talks more about maximizing opportunities, about refining the setup, about working with engineers instead of trying to understand the car. That shift might sound subtle. In Formula One, it's enormous. It suggests Hamilton is no longer spending mental energy predicting what the Ferrari might do. He's thinking about what he wants it to do. That's exactly where every driver wants to be. There is another fascinating consequence of Ferrari's discovery. It doesn't only help Hamilton, it changes how the entire team approaches development. For months, Ferrari's engineers had to balance two very different driving styles. Charles Leclerc naturally adapts to a lively front end and a car that rotates aggressively into corners. Hamilton prefers stability before commitment. Trying to satisfy both drivers often forced engineers into uncomfortable compromises. Now they may have found common ground. Instead of designing around one driver's preferences, Ferrari appears to be creating a broader operating window that benefits both. That could become one of the team's biggest strengths, because championship-winning teams rarely depend on one driver. They depend on two drivers consistently scoring points, sharing feedback, and accelerating development together. If Hamilton and Leclerc are finally pointing the engineers in the same direction, Ferrari's progress could accelerate much faster than rival teams expect. That possibility hasn't gone unnoticed inside the paddock. Several rival engineers have quietly admitted that Ferrari now looks like a much more complete operation, not necessarily because it has the fastest package, but because every weekend appears more organized. Practice sessions follow a clearer plan. Setup changes look more deliberate. Strategy decisions arrive with greater confidence. These are the kinds of improvements that rarely dominate headlines, yet they often separate championship contenders from teams simply capable of winning the occasional race. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson from Ferrari's latest discovery. Formula One breakthroughs are rarely dramatic. Fans imagine revolutionary upgrades, secret aerodynamic concepts, miracle engine developments. The reality is often much simpler. The greatest breakthroughs usually come from understanding how the tires behave, understanding how suspension changes affect balance, understanding how one driver's confidence can unlock performance hidden inside the car all along. Ferrari may have reached exactly that point, and if they have, the implications stretch far beyond one Grand Prix. The remaining races become opportunities rather than experiments. Instead of arriving at each circuit hoping the setup works, Ferrari can arrive expecting it to work. That changes preparation. It changes strategy. Most importantly, it changes belief. Lewis Hamilton has spent almost 2 decades proving what he can achieve when he believes in the machinery beneath him. 7 world championships, more than 100 Grand Prix victories, countless pole positions. Those achievements weren't built solely on talent. They were built on trust. Trust between driver and car, trust between driver and engineer, trust that every lap could be driven at the absolute limit. Ferrari may finally be giving him that trust again. Of course, one discovery doesn't guarantee championships. Mercedes will continue developing. McLaren remains incredibly strong. Red Bull is never far away. Every race presents new challenges. Every circuit asks different questions. But Ferrari's biggest victory may already have happened, not on Sunday afternoon, not on the podium, but inside the engineering room where months of analysis finally revealed why Hamilton couldn't consistently unlock the SF26's potential. Now that mystery appears to have an answer. If Ferrari continues building on this discovery, the second half of the season could look dramatically different from the first. The Hamilton many believed was still adapting may finally disappear. In his place could be the driver Formula One has feared for nearly 2 decades. One who trusts his car, one who attacks without hesitation, one who knows exactly where the limit is, and when Lewis Hamilton reaches that point, history suggests everyone else has a very difficult problem to solve. Because Ferrari may not have simply found more speed. They may have found the missing piece that finally allows one of Formula One's greatest drivers to perform at his absolute best once again. If that happens, this discovery won't just be remembered as another technical breakthrough. It could be remembered as the moment Hamilton's Ferrari career truly began.